Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexi the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. So today we are welcoming Dr. Jonathan Howard to the podcast. And he is the author of an upcoming book, or maybe it's been published already, actually, but it's called Everyone Else is Lying to You: How Our Medical Establishment Weaponized Doubt to Spread COVID, Normalize Quackery, and Undermine Public Health. So welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate you wanting to hear what I have to say.
Great. So to start with, can you give us just a sense of your background? You know, like how did you get interested in this type of thing? And, what do you do in your work?
So I'm a neurologist and I'm a psychiatrist here in New York City. I work at NYU and Bellevue Hospital, although I'm not speaking as an official representative of those organizations. So I think I have two qualifications to speak in this space. Number one, I worked in Bellevue Hospital throughout the pandemic, so I saw what COVID could do with my own eyes when it was spread unchecked 5 years ago, 5.5 years ago now, in the spring of 2020. I saw it deluge our city and overwhelm our hospital. So I saw what it could do with my own eyes. And I've been interested in the anti-vaccine movement since about 2010, when a doctor who I trained with, a woman by the name of Kelly Brogan, morphed into one of the country's most famous, outspoken anti-vaccine doctor. She's kind of a marginal bit player today. But from 2010 until 2020, she was one of the country's most outspoken anti-vaccine doctors. And I became fascinated by the anti-vaccine movement and refuting all of their myths. And in 2018, along with law professor Dory Reese, I wrote a book chapter about the anti-vaccine movement in a book called Pseudoscience. So suffice it to say that I am unfortunately very well prepared for this moment, understanding who the players are, what their arguments are, what their objectives were.
Yeah, and as we'll get to, I'm sure the pandemic really just led to a complete explosion of what had previously been a somewhat marginal, at least, tendency in the broader, American society of anti-vaccine and broadly just crank lunatics and spreaders of falsehoods and fake snake oil stuff now are at they're running the show. The inmates are running the asylum. The monkeys have taken over the zoo. Pick your metaphor. But so the book, so it's specifically about doctors, and you compare them, as I recall, to the merchants of doubt, the famous tobacco industry disinformation spreaders who, contested the scientific knowledge that tobacco causes lung cancer, which was known pretty well, by like the 1950s or something, but they managed to stop that from being considered, a social fact for many years. And so can you give us a few examples of these doctors that you're talking about, and what did they do, during the acute phase of the pandemic and afterwards to spread their message?
Yeah. So if I had told you starting in 2020 that there would be a pandemic and it would be the greatest mass death event in American history, over 1.2 million Americans have died and countless more people have been injured and disabled by the virus. But a vaccine came around in record time and saved probably several million lives of Americans. You would probably think that the anti-vaccine movement would be marginalized in that situation. Obviously, the opposite happened, and you read the subtitle to my book about the medical establishment. So this means that I'm talking about the people who are currently in charge of things, the people who are working under Kennedy Jr., the head of the NIH, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, the head of the FDA, Dr. Marty Makary, the head of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, Dr. Martin Kulldorff, and some of the people who work for them, like Dr. Vinay Prasad and Tracy Beth Hogue. So these are all highly credentialed doctors from very respected universities who spread doubt and misinformation about the pandemic starting in the spring of 2020. So let's just pick Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, for example. And it's important to note that almost none of these guys treated COVID patients. So they experienced the pandemic entirely from their laptops, entirely from their offices, saying they got famous by speaking about themselves in the conditional tense. I would have done that. I would have done this. I called for schools to be open. I called for vulnerable people to be protected. So anyways, his first article was an article published in the Wall Street Journal called "Is the Coronavirus as Deadly as They Say?" And he said that projections of mass death were greatly flawed. He speculated that COVID had 1/10 of the mortality of the flu and that it was going to kill 20 to 40,000 Americans. And today, he is in charge of the head of the NIH. So the book, Everyone Else Is Lying to You, really tells the story of how he weaponized doubt to spread misinformation about COVID, to elevate cranks like Kennedy, and to ultimately seize power where he can achieve his goal of undermining public health organizations. So everything that happened, it started in March and April 2020, is a continuation or everything that happened at the beginning of the pandemic. We are seeing the fruits of that today, unfortunately, as well as the results of institutional silence and cowardice. His own university, Stanford, celebrated his appointment to the NIH and gave him a platform, as did dozens of media organizations who were very credible. So I feel they really let us down.
Just very quickly on that example, because in your book, reading his words there was striking for a number of reasons. One of which was he admits that if he's wrong on that, if actually it's a much more dangerous disease, then all of these lockdowns and all of these measures would be absolutely the right thing to do. And of course, the evidence didn't get him to actually agree with himself on that in the future.
Correct. The very first sentence he wrote the pandemic was a strong defense of shelter-in-place orders and quarantines, much stronger than anything I wrote. He now tries to revise history and claim that he never really said those words. So a whole chapter of the book is about how the history of the pandemic is being rewritten. So, for example, in 2020, Dr. Bhattacharya was all about herd immunity through mass infection. He was a leader of what I call the "we want them infected" movement. That quote comes from a kind of bit player in things, a doctor by the name of Paul Alexander, who said in an email, he was an advisor to President Trump in 2020, and he said that we want them infected. He wrote those words. The plan was to mass infect everyone under the age of 60 or everyone under the age of 70, because they believed, even though the virus was just 1 year old at this time, that one infection led to robust, permanent immunity. They believed that herd immunity was inevitable. They believed that young people had essentially no risk from the virus. Death was the only bad outcome that they mentioned. And so we're now talking about the Great Barrington Declaration, which was written on October 4th, 2020, has a very interesting background we should talk about. But it was this plan to get rid of all COVID mitigation measures, except for people in nursing homes who would be magically, hermetically sealed in a protective bubble and just let everyone else get COVID. Now, if you listen to Dr. Jay Bhattacharya talk about the Great Barrington Declaration today, he will not mention herd immunity. He will not mention natural immunity. And by the way, they claim this would end the pandemic in 3 to 6 months, that it would be over in that rapid time frame. To hear him talk about it today, he is a benevolent soul who just wanted poor children in schools, and, Black and brown children were missing out on education, and cancer screenings weren't getting done. And he just wanted businesses to be able to, people to earn an income and churches to be open. So he's really revising the history of the pandemic. He's very good at erasing his own words, which is why it's very important that myself and others have recorded them.
Yeah, I think it's worth, sort of getting into that that argument a little bit, because it's coming back. There's another book, In COVID's Wake, by a couple of Princeton political scientists. I think we can maybe talk about that a little bit more later. But, they talk a lot about Sweden and how they attempted a let her rip strategy in March 2020. And, what happened was, they had a huge surge of infections. Sweden actually did worse than the United States, remarkably, in the first months of the pandemic in terms of deaths, because it is actually quite risky for even middle-aged people, even sometimes younger people die. It's worse. It's in the early stages of the pandemic, it was way more deadly than the flu, a typical flu season for even babies. Nevertheless, at the same time, as the Swedish people learned that this, virus is actually pretty bad, they self-locked down. And Sweden had almost the same economic hit as other Nordic countries that did do a strict lockdown. People weren't going to bars and restaurants. They weren't spending money. They were staying at home as much as they could. A lot of people pulled their kids out of school out of fear. They didn't want their kids infected, and they didn't want to get infected by their kids. And at the same time, it inevitably got into nursing homes and killed, hundreds of elderly Swedish people. So it was just a total disaster. The thing they were proposing was not possible to accomplish, basically pre-vaccine. And it would have led to a total tidal wave of preventable deaths, and it wouldn't have accomplished what they thought it was going to accomplish. People's natural fear would have recreated more or less the same social and economic effect as attempting to actual coordinated mitigation that a lot of other countries managed.
Can you actually mention the bear in the camp analogy? Because I think it's a brilliant way to explain why the logic of the people in favor of herd immunity, which is their argument doesn't, as you point out, actually relate to herd immunity, but something else. But the bear in the camp analogy, I think, is a great explainer of why the number of deaths over time goes down. And it's not because we have a more robust protection against the virus, right?
Well, so we do not have herd immunity to COVID. Herd immunity is defined by cases, the number of people who are getting infected. And when you have herd immunity for a disease, although it's very tenuous and it depends exactly where you live, but we do have herd immunity to measles. What it means is someone without protection, meaning a baby less than 1 year old, because that's when they get the MMR vaccine, can lead a normal baby life and not be exposed to measles. So we have herd immunity to measles currently. So the bear in the camp analogy refers to Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, who tried to redefine the term herd immunity, I think in 2022 or 2023 in a podcast, to say that what herd immunity means is that when you get COVID, it's much less likely to kill you than in 2020. That's not a definition of herd immunity. And some random person on Twitter made an analogy to a rampaging bear attacking a campsite. If it picked off the easy victims first and then came back the next day and had a harder time catching people, that doesn't mean that the bear has gotten any less dangerous. Now, obviously, COVID has not overwhelmed hospitals in years, thank God. And one of the reasons for that, tragically, is that 1.2 million people who were by definition vulnerable are no longer here for the virus to kill a second time. And the formal term for that is mortality displacement. So he changes terms to avoid admitting that he was wrong about herd immunity being this inevitable thing. And we have never established herd immunity to a virus by natural immunity alone, even if one infection meant lifetime immunity, as it does for measles and chickenpox, because babies, those who are most vulnerable to COVID, are not born with natural immunity. So it's impossible to achieve herd immunity to a virus without a vaccine. Now, you mentioned the case of Sweden, which is very interesting because there's been a lot of myth making about Sweden, as you said. Sweden really had two pandemics, 2020 and kind of after that. And 2020, especially the spring, was a disaster. As you said, it ripped through their nursing homes, killing many more, a much higher rate than its Nordic neighbors. However, people were saying Sweden had herd immunity or was close to herd immunity in the spring of 2020. Again, the head of our advisory committee on immunization practices, Dr. Martin Kulldorff, was tweeting that Sweden was halfway to herd immunity in April 2020. And in an interview in July 2020, Dr. Bhattacharya said that New York and Sweden had achieved herd immunity. In the fall of 2020, They had to institute drastic measures to contain the virus when it started coming roaring back. They had to close colleges. They had to close high schools. And although Sweden never closed elementary schools on an individual level, on a countrywide basis, on an individual level, schools closed for prolonged times. It's very easy to find headlines of schools closing. This school will close down for 1 month, etc., due to COVID outbreaks. Exactly the same that happened here. During the Delta wave, during the Omicron wave, the virus closed schools. But our current medical establishment speaks about all these as a choice, that these were choices made by incompetent administrators. So they spent their whole time making podcasts, making YouTube videos, saying if only I was in charge, everything would be fine. So it was just an attack on people who had to deal with things in the real world. And now that they are in charge, are they proving themselves to be competent managers? Is trust in our CDC and our FDA spiking? It is not. And I should say schools, there's a school that's closed in Kansas, just one, and hopefully there won't be more due to COVID while they are in charge. And schools closed in Florida during the Delta wave when they ran the show. So I think it's important not to look at their hypothetical statements about what they would do and things they called for. It's important to look at what actually did happen.
Yeah, and the other thing perhaps to mention about Sweden, the in COVID's wake people make a great hay out of the fact that Sweden ended up having, according to some studies at least, the lowest death rate, overall, excess mortality rate of any country in Western Europe, basically. And the reason for that, actually, if you look into it, is that after their brutal 2020, where they did way worse than all of their Nordic neighbors, they, as you said, ended up doing a whole lot of pandemic controls. But the other thing they did, much better than the other Nordics, was a really aggressive rollout, first of vaccines, which most of Europe did pretty well at that, but then critically booster shots, because they did booster shots better than anyone in Europe that I can tell, and especially better than, Finland and Norway, which kind of dropped the ball, like a lot of other European countries. And as a result, they had a very almost no excess mortality in 2022, whereas their Nordic neighbors and a lot of the rest of Europe just got nailed by Omicron. And that one is so much more contagious that even, the mitigation measures don't really work that well against it. And so it was very hard to keep out of, nursing homes and so forth. And so the reason why Sweden ended up having a relatively overall decent pandemic was their public health bureaucracy was very effective. And they did, classic public health stuff, very, very aggressive rollout of vaccines. And it worked. It worked really well. And these jokers, perhaps we should talk about that now, spreading doubt about vaccines. Because this, as you say, it's like a freaking miracle. The previous world record for vaccine development was something like 4 years. We had this in about 11 months through all the trials. Probably could have had it faster, but you still beat the, previous world record by a lot. And yet you see just endless fear mongering about the vaccine. So can you tell us what they say and what that reflects, sort of about the general rhetorical strategy that these people use?
Yeah, so what's happening to vaccines in this country is a real tragedy. And I think it's interesting to note that in the spring of 2020, when these vaccines were first being rolled out, again, like the virus, they were brand new. We had a lot to learn about them. All of these doctors massively overhyped them. They claimed that they offered perfect protection against severe disease. They claimed that they blocked transmission, and they claimed that they would end the pandemic. I wrote an article about this for Science Based Medicine. You can just Google my name, Jonathan Howard, overhype vaccines, and you can see all of these direct quotes. When that turned out not to be the case, unfortunately, these doctors, Dr. Bhattacharya, Dr. Marty Makary, Dr. Vinay Prasad, did not admit error. Rather, they started blaming other people for their own words. They said, we were told that these vaccines would stop transmission. We were told that they were perfect. And rather than recognize that they were the ones who said that, they started throwing other people under the bus. And they have used that doubt, the overhyping of COVID vaccines 4 years ago in the spring of 2021 to try to wipe out COVID vaccines for tens of millions of Americans. And now they are starting their assault on the hepatitis B vaccine and God knows what else. The RSV vaccine, one imagines Gardasil, the HPV vaccine is in their sight. I mean, this is what animates Robert Kennedy Jr., but these mainstream respectable doctors, again, Makary, Prasad, and Bhattacharya, were willing to elevate RFK Jr., writing absurd articles that he was going to be the savior of vaccines because he would do these brilliant randomized controlled trials of the entire vaccine schedule that would entirely answer every question we've ever had about vaccines. You know, and doubt about vaccines is as old as vaccines themselves since the days of Edward Jenner. But apparently Robert F. Kennedy was finally going to do the research that would quell anti-vaccine myths and remove all doubt about vaccines. And things haven't turned out that way, predictably.
I mean, the thing about RFK is that he's just a liar. You know, he's a dishonest person and has been for years. And you go and look at, you know, he just recently put out a justification for rolling back federal support for mRNA vaccine research, you know, which is in development for all kinds of stuff. And he assembled this collection of studies, and you look at the studies, and most of them don't even have anything to do with mRNA. It's about a lot of them are about the coronavirus spike protein itself, you know, so they do a study where they take the spike protein and inject tons of it directly into people, sometimes right into their brain, the brain of test animals, that is, and it would cause lots of problems. Like, that's a different thing. That's not what the mRNA does. So that's not how the vaccine works. And even in those studies, a lot of them would say, you know, because they're not even doing a vaccine study, they would admit sometimes that, or not admit, they would just state that clearly COVID vaccination is, highly worth doing and far less risky than getting COVID itself. And this is the type of just transparently fraudulent, dishonest practice that is so common among the anti-vaccine movement and the general sort of science denial across the world in many different contexts. You just like assemble a quantity of research and you point to it and you rely on people not actually going through and reading and trying to make a, informed opinion about what you're talking about. You just like, see, look, I proved it. And that's good enough, apparently.
Is this key, by the way? Because it occurs to me, the Make America Healthy Again, we could think of that as predating even that term. The people who always said, just do your own research, these anti-vaxxers who I think, are bolstered by these kind of quack, fake evidentiary proposals by somebody like RFK, but they just Google something, see that, don't actually know anything or look into what Ryan just explained is incorrect about the assertions, but then think they've done their own independent verification and then are justified in like joining the group to say that the experts are just fooling everyone. Like, how do you think the psychology works to get people on board with anti-vax vaccine? Is this part of the whole method that people like RFK get others to buy into it?
Yeah, I was very familiar with these sort of techniques. This is where my experience, I think, came in handy. My bizarre, weird obsession with the anti-vaccine movement that started in 2010. I remember in about 2013 or so, there was a wellness influencer and an anti-vaccine advocate, a guy by the name of Sayer G, who again is now kind of a bit player, but he runs a website called Green Med Info. And he published a collection of articles called 200 Evidence-Based Reasons Not to Vaccinate. And I got a hold of that and I was like, oh my God. And I started reading through some of the titles. And one of them was, an outbreak of measles occurred in a highly vaccinated population. So that concerned me. So I read it. And basically what they were saying that was true, that there was a community, I think it was in San Diego, where 95% of the people were vaccinated, but they still had a measles outbreak. And the reason why is the 5% of unvaccinated people kind of all clustered together, these families that didn't vaccinate their children. And so what the article was saying is that you can have high vaccination rates of measles in a city, but if all of the unvaccinated people cluster together, you can still have outbreaks. And that happened here in New York City in 2019 when there was an outbreak in the Orthodox Jewish community. It happened in Minnesota, I think in 2018 when there was an outbreak in the Somali community. So yes, twisting studies and changing words is an old anti-vaccine tactic. Nothing that's happening now is new. And you can even read anti-vaccine literature from the 1800s, and it's all the same sort of fears of contamination, of impurity, this idea that you're injecting a foreign substance into you to protect against a virus, which is natural and a sort of rite of passage, and that vaccines haven't been studied. So none of this is new. None of this changes.
Connected to like a eugenicist, social Darwinist person? Because I remember having students who, because when you talked about the purity of the blood and injecting something else into it, I remember having students, one of which I remember thinking was just this sweet, very respectful, intelligent student. He had parents in the medical profession and everything. And when COVID started up, he said, "Oh, I'm not going to get vaccinated. I don't need that. My body's strong. It can handle the virus." Like this idea that he is strong enough to take it and others might be weak and they will not be able to handle it, but he doesn't need it because he's one of the strong members of our species. And it just struck me that a lot of this language from RFK and others is very eugenicist in that kind of way.
Yeah, so this is where experience on COVID unit comes in handy, because we all saw some young, healthy people either die or become severely injured by COVID. I mean, again, it was not a common thing, but it certainly wasn't zero. And I think Derek Barris of the Conspirituality podcast has spoken about this the best. He has coined it soft eugenics. I mean, we're not yet, thank God, putting, people in gas chambers. But it's this sort of idea of survival of the fittest. And yes, this idea that vaccine preventable diseases only impact children with underlying medical conditions is both true. False, and it's a gross thing to sort of say. And I have a chapter in this in the prequel to Everyone Else's Line 2, the book We Want Them Infected. So Dr. Marty Makary was a big promoter of this myth. He is currently the head of the FDA, and he claimed that he did a study during COVID that no healthy children had died. So I read this study. It was not a study. It was called a white paper. It was an analysis of insurance claims, and only 3 children had died in that study. And by that point in the pandemic, about 400 or 500 children had died. So he was investigating just, under 1% of them. And there was nothing there about what medical conditions they had. But he would often go on the news and say, it was only children with leukemia who were dying, implying that these were children who were just about to die on a Saturday when COVID killed them on a Friday. Now, if you look at the data, it's unusual for healthy children to die of COVID, thank God. About 75% of children who did die had some underlying medical conditions, but those underlying medical conditions were asthma and obesity. These were common conditions that, a 15-year-old with asthma is going to, normally live to be 75. And so had someone said, yes, COVID affects children who have underlying conditions more. If your child is obese or has asthma, we really strongly recommend the vaccine. That would have been a fair thing to say. But that's not how these guys were saying it. And Dr. Makary has also said this about the 2 recent measles deaths in Texas, that these were children with underlying conditions, as if you can just brush them off and dismiss them, and we don't have to worry about them. And again, death is not the only bad outcome from either measles or COVID, but it's the only one they recognized. In their view, either you died or you had lifelong immunity.
Yeah, and something, by the way, to mention about measles, correct me if I'm wrong, but I've been reading up on this. There's a there's like a cohort of people out there who think that COVID just like permanently damages your immune system. As far as I can tell, that isn't the case. it's basically a normal respiratory virus. People can have long COVID, which almost by necessity would mean messing up your immune system in some way. But measles, actually, it does seem to like reset your immune system, right? And so even if you're like a normal, healthy person and you get a case of measles and you clear it out, normally you don't get very sick, then, all of your previous, immunity to other diseases for potentially some years can go away, and then you can get infected with all kinds of crap.
That research came out, I think, in 2019 by Harvard scientist Dr. Michael Mina. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's just the type of this whole idea that it's natural, like it exists in nature, and therefore it must be good to get it. It's like no, this can mess you up, even if you don't have a bad case. You want to avoid it if you can, and we have the technology.
Actually, now that Ryan mentioned long COVID, would you mind just briefly talking about the dangers of COVID that people might not be aware of? Because there is, I think, this common misconception that it's this reminds me of the underestimating the danger of the flu as well. I remember people saying, look at the numbers on people killed by the flu and trying to minimize the danger of COVID that way, when really that just means we underappreciated how dangerous the flu also was in terms of how it harmed people and killed people. And this reminds me too of the argument that was put forth about like, oh, they had underlying conditions, which should make us more concerned with protective measures for people that are vulnerable. I don't know, Ryan, if you saw recently, a poor starving child in Gaza was featured in the New York Times.
Yeah.
And then they did a correction about, well, sorry for being worried about the starvation. Actually, there were underlying issues, as if that's not worse. Right? Yeah. Anyway, so could you speak a little to all that?
Well, long COVID is kind of my Achilles heel. I don't talk about it a lot just because I think a lot of other people do a much better job of it than me. So I try to stick to what I know. And I have a little bit of a hard time wrapping my head around how truly kind of common it is, because the more symptoms you include, the more common it is. And the less symptoms you include,
it's like
the
a
rarer
cluster of different things. Yeah.
Yeah. So I speak about long COVID only to acknowledge two things. A lot of people have been severely affected by that. There's no question about that. And the second thing I say is we have a lot to learn. We have to be humble about the potential for the consequences of repeat infections. A child born today may be infected with COVID 10 times by the time they're 20. And what's that going to do? And we are learning that other viruses seem to cause a lot of problems. For example, the chicken pox, people who get the shingles vaccine seems to have a much lower rate of dementia. So maybe chicken pox is involved in causing dementia. The main disease that I treat, multiple sclerosis, was recently proven to be basically proven as best as you can do to be caused by the Epstein-Barr virus. Certain cases of herpes encephalitis have led to autoimmune encephalitis and psychosis. So we just have a lot to learn. But all of our doctors treated COVID as this extremely, when I say all of our doctors, all of the doctors who are now in charge and working with Kennedy and who I write about, treated COVID as this very familiar virus from day one, and we know everything about it. But when talking about the vaccine, you will hear, we don't know the long-term complications. We need more study. We need more research. And it got to the point where they were even treating abnormal lab values in children who feel fine after vaccination. They just get their blood drawn as part of a study. They were treating that much more seriously than literal death from COVID. When talking about children dying of COVID, they would say, it's less than the number of children who die in car crashes or who die of drowning. It's about the same as the flu. And it's just breathless fear mongering. And an 80-year-old has 1,000 times the risk. I mean, all of these sort of techniques to compare and to minimize the virus that way. But when talking about rare, mild, temporary vaccine side effects, they treated that as catastrophic. And this is still going on. For example, Dr. Vinay Prasad, about 2 months ago, gave a presentation about why he was limiting the COVID vaccine for healthy people under age 65. And when doing that, he talked about a cardiac MRI finding called late gadolinium enhancement, which occurs in about 1 in 62,000 young men after getting the COVID vaccine. And he was saying that this is not a benign finding, that it could lead to cardiac scarring, which could lead to a cardiac arrhythmia and cause problems later in life. Okay, fine. Maybe he's right. But he's treating a purely hypothetical, theoretical problem more seriously than he treated literal death from COVID. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that.
Yeah, right. This is one of those classic narratives that, yeah, studies find a very minor risk of what is it called? Myocarditis, right? It's heart swelling, among especially young men who get the vaccine, while ignoring the fact that a case of COVID carries a much greater risk of the exact same complication in a much more severe form. People have died. Young men have died of acute myocarditis. And yeah, it's just a bunch of these classic techniques are sort of assembling here. You have your just straightforward lies. You have your, pile of studies that are real studies, but don't say what they say you say. You have a biased perspective, like you were saying, you drag stuff completely out of context and wildly overhype one thing while just completely ignoring the other thing. That's much worse. And there's also one of the rhetorical techniques that they seem very common to use is a claim of oppression, of censorship from the dread medical establishment, that when people come in, the previous public health authorities who believed in science, and they would see people, running their mouths about vaccine during a once in a century pandemic and be like, hey, shut up, stop saying that stuff. You're going to kill people. And then they go, oh, I'm being victimized by the dread, liberal censors. The censorious woke SJWs are coming for me. And what's interesting, I want to talk about the one of these guys in particular. You mentioned him before, Vinay Prasad, who, did all of this stuff now, but now the shoe is on the other foot, as it were, and he has been censoring your YouTube videos. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so these guys were very good at weaponizing their perceived victimhood and complaining that any attempt to correct their misinformation was censorship. And if you just type, for example, Jay Bhattacharya censorship into YouTube, you will find dozen videos. And if you just type his name into YouTube, you'll find 100 videos. These guys were celebrities. They had access to President Trump, to Ron DeSantis. They were all over the media and social media. So they were not censored, which is how they got into power to begin with. Power now, at least. And what happened to them, I didn't really follow the details of it extensively because the fate of a couple YouTube videos and a couple tweets didn't really seem to matter to me when 3,000 people were dying daily. But they treated their social media content more seriously than anything that happened in a hospital, than the death of any young person. So when talking about what happened to my YouTube channel, I want to recognize a few things. This is a very, very trivial loss for the world. I am not a victim. There are scientists who are losing their jobs, who are losing their fundings. There are scientists who are being fired, who are being purged, who are really being censored. I am not one of those. So I am not a victim at all. But what I did about a year ago is I set up a YouTube channel, and 99% of it was just videos of what these doctors had said. And these were the videos that were circulating on Twitter. I generally don't turn a camera on myself. I did a couple times in some of these videos, but 99% of them were just clips of what these guys had said and that were circulating on YouTube. And to me, my YouTube channel was a storage vault because I would post those articles in my science-based medicine articles. I would post those videos in my science-based medicine articles so that I could discuss them. And a couple other bloggers did that as well. And last week, I got a message that my YouTube channel had been taken down because Vinay Prasad complained that I had violated his copyright, for example. And I don't think he knew that by making those complaints, I would be able to see who did that. But that's the information that YouTube sent to me. And My YouTube channel had 250 followers. An average video that I posted got 10 views. And at first I thought this was all kind of funny, right? That here we have a senior FDA official, coming after a YouTube account where the video's got about 10 views. And I should add, he is not upset when other people do exactly what I did. There is a anti-vaccine account on X called Chief Nerd, which has posted dozens of his videos, and Chief Nerd has even branded those videos. Anyways, I thought it was kind of funny that he would kind of come after me this way. And someone in the Guardian kind of helped me realize, a journalist, that, this is actually a little bit more serious than that. That, he is taking down videos that are nothing but him speaking. He is silencing himself. And in response, Vinay Prasad, or at least someone at the FDA, gave the following response. They said, all of Dr. Prasad's videos that were illegally taken and published by another party remain available for all to watch on YouTube. Publishing someone else's videos without modification or commentary is a clear copyright violation. Okay, fine. This is the bad sentence. The mission of Jonathan Howard was not medical transparency, but personal profit by grifting and stealing someone else's intellectual property. So that's where it gets nasty. I made $0 from my YouTube channel with 250 followers. The only thing I have monetized is the sale of my books. Meanwhile, Vinay Prasad did monetize his Substack, his YouTube channel, I believe his Twitter account as well. And he cannot come up with arguments against me. And so he has to lie by saying I'm personally profiting by grifting and stealing someone else's intellectual property. And again, he is fine when anti-vaccine accounts do the exact same thing. But don't worry.
It's always projection, isn't it, with these guys?
Oh, yeah.
You guys are censoring. They censor. You guys are grifting. They're grifting. Like, it's every single time, it's just incredible.
Correct. And I intended my YouTube channel, which again got no attention, but in my vision, it was a storage vault. It was a repository. So people could go there and just hear these doctors in their own words. I am in the process of reassembling all of the videos, and they are not gone. They are not lost. And I have plans for that channel to create, to become what he was, a YouTuber, to start turning a camera on myself and making commentary about these videos. And my current plans, I'm actually going to talk to a lawyer to make sure that this is okay, is to assemble my entire collection in a 10-hour video so that people can just scroll through and click and see how every stage of the pandemic, these doctors spent the past 5 years in TV studios, in podcast booths, just spreading doubt, no matter what was happening on the ground, whether it was Delta, whether it was Omicron. It was always, don't worry. The CDC is lying. The FDA is lying. Fauci is lying. Everyone is lying to you except for me.
Let's talk about that real quick, because that and the rewriting of the history of COVID today, the role that all of that has played in not transforming, besides all the terrible things it's doing, not transforming our welfare state and our public health system to what it could be, to be more like the Nordic systems, to be something that actually doesn't prioritize profit. The kind of perverse thing here is you have people that like RFK because they know that there are some problems with pharmaceutical companies, and they know there are some problems with the way that profit comes first for a lot of the way that capitalism interacts with health. Mm-hmm. But of course, the perversity has more to do with, like, not everyone could get the vaccine around the world as they should have. And intellectual property was weaponized to prevent people from being vaccinated. Not that the vaccine was the problem. But when I was, suffering like others were through witnessing mass death and everything, my thought was, well, maybe the silver lining here is we'll get universal health care. Maybe people will realize that we're all interconnected domestically and globally. Maybe now it's too obvious. It's too obvious how much we need to come together to help each other, and we're bound up together in this way. So maybe you could speak to why that didn't happen and the role that these people played in that.
Yeah. So first of all, everything you're saying about pharmaceutical companies is true. However, vaccines save money by keeping people safe and out of the hospital. I think Walker Bragman, a journalist, has done probably more than I have to investigate all of this. And I include several lengthy examples of his articles in my book. So thank you for letting me do that, Walker, but really investigating the financial conflicts of interest that these doctors had. Some of them had them directly. I already mentioned Vinay Prasad, and actually Jay Bhattacharya did this too, who monetized some of his media accounts. So they had financial incentives to produce content that would keep eyeballs on them and keep their Substack subscribers happy. Others of them teamed up with business interests. So this is where it's worth kind of circling back to the origins of the Great Barrington Declaration. This was sponsored by something called AIR. I always forget what they stand for, the American Economic Institute Research or something like this, which is located in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, which has a lot of funding from the Koch industries, which at the time was led by a gentleman by the name of Jeffrey Tucker, who now runs a website called the Brownstone Institute, which is just a font of anti-vaccine disinformation. And to give you an idea of who Jeffrey Tucker is, in 2016, he wrote a book, an article called Let the Kids Work. You can still Google that, which is an overt child labor article. And he remains proud of that. Walker Bragman got a hold of some of his emails from a couple of years ago saying he still favors child labor. So this is who these guys were willing to partner with, who cared so much about poor children in schools. So they woke washed the pandemic. What they did is they would take narratives that are dear to the left about the education of minority children and the working class whose businesses are being destroyed by the lockdowns while wealthy scientists and bankers just stay home and order DoorDash. When in reality, they were willing to partner with some of the worst actors of the far right who, needless to say, aren't motivated by concerns about public health and poor and minority children's education. So I think what you're saying is correct. I mean, and at the beginning of the pandemic, I mean, think about what the government did for a couple of months. They really sort of took care of people. And obviously that can't be supported over the long term. And I'm no economist about exactly how much that may have played into inflation, et cetera. But at least it gave people a vision of a different sort of government, and one that these guys wanted to squash desperately and successfully. And these guys also hung out with Republican politicians. They claimed to be apolitical, neutral scientists. That was a very important selling point for them, that they just followed the data and the evidence and the science, and they were apolitical, whereas everyone who disagreed with them was just blinded by tribalism and their hatred of President Trump. But one thing my 10-hour video clip will show is that they used emotions, and they appealed to people's anger, and they appealed to people's rage to try to spread doubt. And a lot of the videos are them with stars of the far-right ecosystem. Steve Bannon, Jay Bhattacharya recently appeared on Steve Bannon's podcast explaining his why he is cutting research in mRNA technology, this Nobel Prize winning technology. But Tucker Carlson, dozens of Fox News hosts, even Charlie Kirk, I think, makes an appearance, as well as all sorts of Republican politicians, Ron Johnson, Jim Jordan. So they had these strong right connections with the right, which is why they are in the positions of power that they're in currently.
Yeah, maybe we should talk about that in a little more detail. As you say, all of these people, above all RFK Jr. at HHS, they are running America's public health bureaucracy. Just recently, we saw mass resignations at the CDC in protest of the director being fired for not being anti-vax enough, I guess. And it seems, I think it's fair to say that this is an unprecedented attack on America's public health capacity, like our ability to do anything about, epidemic disease, cleanliness of our food, and the purity of medicines and so on. Like all that is coming under total assault, both in terms of the direct program and just the institutional capacity, employment, the number of workers who are there to do these tasks. It's just devastating. So can you talk about that? About what the legacy, what it means now to have these people in charge?
Yeah, so most of my book, everything everyone else has lied to you, was written in 2024. However, publication got delayed, which turned out to be a good thing in that it allowed me to write a chapter on the first 3 or 4 months of what RFK and his cronies are doing. So the book is current as of the end of May 2025. So it was really kind of a blessing in disguise that publication got delayed, because it allowed me to kind of make it up to date and really incorporate how they are destroying and taking a wrecking ball to everything. And had the election gone the other way, which unfortunately it didn't, but I would be accused of hysterical fear mongering, and which was leveled at me kind of in 2023 and 2024, as well, as I and many others were trying to warn about these guys. Having said that, I vastly underestimated their capacity to destroy things, the speed at which they are moving. I knew that RFK Jr. would want to do these sorts of things, because that's been his operating principle for 20 years, to undermine confidence in vaccines. But I never imagined that people like Dr. Makary and Jay Bhattacharya and Vinay Prasad would go along with it, but they are. And so Kennedy fired all of the experts on the advisory committee on immunization practices at the CDC and replaced them with some of the worst internet cranks like Robert Malone, who's just this crank doctor. Just yesterday, where Vinay Prasad and Marty Makary run the show, they removed Paul Offit from the FDA Advisory Vaccine Committee. He is probably the country's most famous, along with Peter Hotez, outspoken pro-vaccine doctor. And those guys have been at it for 20 years, battling RFK Jr. So while they are sad that they lost a YouTube video and some tweets, they are engaged in mass purges. They are engaged in mass censorship. They are politicizing science. And it's only going to get worse from here. And I have no positive words of encouragement to offer anyone. I'm just here to document it all. But things are going to get worse before they're going to get better. And the repercussions are going to be felt for decades. A child who's going to be born in 2030 might not be vaccinated because RFK Jr. successfully poisoned the minds of millions of Americans against vaccines. So the legacy of what we're seeing now is going to last for decades. It's much easier to destroy things than to build things back up. So not a positive note from me there.
Yeah, we got work to do for sure.
What kind of messaging do you think going forward, but also if we look back at the Biden administration, which wasn't, I don't think, perfect in dealing with COVID, what would have been a better way to combat these cranks from the left perspective? Because I think part of the problem typically in the Republicans and the Democrats is the Democrats don't have the courage, the convictions to actually give enough forceful rebuttal and actually speak in a positive vision that can combat the kind of right wing talking points. And for example, Biden, I remember, had the famous Independence Day, July 4th, COVID will be over, and let's open up everything because the economy is what matters. And of course, a lot of people died under various Democratic governors and mayors, and there was a lot of maybe coherence with some of the reactionary talking points in terms of how the dangers of COVID were minimized and how the economy, the abstraction of the economy, was put first. What do you think in terms of what a better way would have been, or going forward, how we should think about these kinds of things?
One critique of my work is that I've been kind of too soft on Biden and his sort of advisors, Anish Jha, for example. And we want them infected. I do have one line about how 700,000 Americans died under Biden's presidency. And I quote a line from the football coach, Bill Parcells, who was asked many years ago, how good is your team? And he said, you're as good as your record says you are. So if you're a 4-12 team, you're a 4-12 team. Doesn't matter how you lost those 12 games or how you won those 4 games. That's your record. So Biden's record is hundreds of thousands of deaths, and we need to be clear about that. One thing that I wonder, and we'll never know, is how much better someone else could have been. Because one thing that I have come to appreciate in the course of writing my books and accumulating all these videos is that there were powerful forces aligned against him, and they were everywhere. Even though I mentioned the far right ecosystem, they were also in the liberal publications, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, CNN, and these doctors carefully tailored their message to the audience that they were speaking to. So while recognizing Biden's record, who knows if someone else could have done better? It's easy to sort of say, kind of do a reverse fantasy and say, if I was in charge, everything would have, I would have contained COVID.
I'm
so
even
it's hard to say.
I'm even less concerned about Biden in particular. But as you say, those liberal publications are speaking to a kind of ideology that's, economic liberalism is focused on in a certain way the free market to the detriment of the public good sometimes. And you have even liberals talking about lockdowns when we weren't exactly China, okay? We weren't even South Korea. Like the rewriting of history in terms of how these mitigation, how severe the mitigation measures were is ridiculous comparatively, it seems to me, especially when you had states like, what was it, Missouri, that was like banning tracking, like they thought it was like the NSA was tracking you if we're following the spread of the cases. And so they had like laws to prevent data collection. This is like, as you say, these are some of the forces we were dealing with, but we need an overhaul ideologically of our understanding of what freedom requires when it comes to public health, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little bit wary of sort of saying, as others have, that the government, that the government should have fought misinformation. I mean, I do think they should have fought misinformation better. Don't get me wrong, but how they officially should have done that, it's not clear, because I don't want RFK Jr. establishing a government of misinformation and silencing me even more than I'm already silenced. So most of my sort of anger and the conclusion actually to everyone else's line to you is directed at members of my own profession. I think a lot of doctors showed more courage running into the rooms of COVID patients than they did fighting members of their own profession. And we as doctors have to police our own, and we didn't. And not everyone can fight every battle. There's a million battles where I have nothing to say on abortion, on drugs, on homelessness. It's not that I don't care about those things, just that others do a much better job of that. And I try to specialize. So not everyone has to fight this specific battle. But these universities, in the name of institutional neutrality, that's just a way of letting themselves off the hook. And we also have to be very careful about policing misinformation, because an outsider may have a correct idea. And the best example that I can think of this is, I always botch her name, is Karina Kariko. She was the mRNA scientist whose research led to the mRNA vaccines, and she won a Nobel Prize for that. After being sort of marginalized and laughed at her entire career. But when these guys said things like, the flu killed more children than COVID, at a time when 10 children had died of a flu and 1,000 children had died of COVID, institutions should say something about these basic facts. Instead, they tried to frame it as thinking differently and heterodox thinking. And the last chapter of my book calls out in particular a doctor by the name of Jeffrey Flyer, who is the former dean of Harvard Medical School, who this time last year was warning about the dangers of DEI to medical education in a single class at UCLA, and who is promoting the disinformation of Vinay Prasad. Vinay Prasad wrote an article in 2022. Let me just give you an example of how these guys were willing to spread untruths, saying that, and I think it was published in Barry Weiss's The Free Press, just to give you an idea, but he wrote an article saying COVID vaccines shouldn't be routine for children. And his argument was that if we stress COVID vaccines, then children will somehow miss out on diseases that are deadlier for them, like polio and measles. So he presented no evidence that if you vaccinate children against COVID, that they are not going to be vaccinated against measles and polio. And at the time that he was writing that article, COVID was threatening children, not polio and not measles. So, for example, in January 2022 alone, about 150 to 200 children died of COVID. This was the Omicron wave, the worst part of the pandemic for children. It was sending about 1,000 children to the hospital every single day. And Vinay Prasad was arguing, no, we have to prioritize polio vaccinations. Meanwhile, polio hasn't even affected a single child in the United States in the past 40 to 50 years. Now, the reason I bring this up is because Jeffrey Flyer, the former dean of Harvard Medical School, posted that article on social media and said these arguments are quite reasonable. And I responded by saying, it's actually not reasonable to say that polio and measles are more dangerous for children than COVID, and you don't have to pick and choose. And rather than engage with me about, I think, pretty obvious things, he insulted me. He called me nasty, dishonest, and woefully ignorant. I can handle it. It's okay. I'm a big guy.
Sounds like you won the argument if he has to resort to that.
Right. But this is the former dean of Harvard Medical School amplifying this idea that a virus that infected the polio virus, which infected 0 American children in 50 years, is dangerous compared to COVID, which killed 2,000 to 3,000 children, hospitalized 250,000 children over that same time frame. Now, fast forward to today, what is happening? His university, Harvard, we all know, is being Trump has declared war against it. He is writing articles, which I agree with, saying RFK is a disaster and Harvard, should not be attacked by the Trump administration. Meanwhile, the doctor who he elevated, Vinay Prasad, is cheering on the attacks on Harvard, is cheering on RFK Jr. So yes, the Biden administration could have done a better job. The liberal media, I do have a whole chapter on all the articles these guys wrote in the Washington Post and the Atlantic and this sort of thing, could have done a better job. But most of my anger is devoted to these high-ranking doctors, the chairman of medicine at UCSF and at Stanford, who said nothing as their faculty members said 1 + 1 = 3, or even worse, cheered it on and said, again, this is just heterodox, different thinking, and that people like me who provided accurate information are the problem. I was the problem because I said, no, actually, a virus which kills 2,000 children is more dangerous than a virus which kills 0.
Yeah. You see, they're not triggered by wokeness and DEI. They're triggered by reality. That's what really gets them mad.
Yeah, and this is what happens when the pandemic became political. Is Vinay Prasad was being associated with the right, and I was associated with the left and DEI. I never billed myself as progressive. I've kept my politics strictly to myself. Matter of fact, I confess, and this is kind of embarrassing, that I still kind of view Ayn Rand as a positive influence on my life. I mean, and I'll tell you why. Because
is it because she was hooking up with Alan Greenspan? Is that the
2 reasons? Number one, her writing taught me that nothing matters more than reality. That A is A. That's sort of a phrase that she used a lot, and so that yes. When you see someone saying polio is more dangerous than COVID, they are wrong. And so she taught me that, and hopefully that's not something that should need teaching, but evidently it does. And that individuals shouldn't be afraid to stand against groups. So I'm not an individual. I don't want to make it seem like I'm the only one out here doing this, because there are dozens of science communicators and people, like Peter Hotez and Paul Offit, who have faced much greater risks than me. Death threats. They've needed bodyguards. Certainly women. Angie Rasmussen has just been a victim of horrible, sexist and sorts of insults. I've been spared all that, thank God. But anyways, she kind of taught me that you should not be afraid to stand alone against a group of powerful people. So I'm not afraid to stand alone against Vinay Prasad and Marty McCary and Jay Bhattacharya. My guess is they're not going to come after me anymore, because they recognize that when they do, the Streisand effect occurs. It only amplifies my work, which again is mostly just quoting and showing videos of them. So if they want to try to take down my 10-hour-long video of words that they said, be my guest. It'll bring more attention to it. Please try to take it down. It'll be the best advertising for my book I could ask for.
I'm going to put a lefty spin on what you just said, in the sense that not just being an individual against large groups, I think you're being a good citizen, which in my sense of the political, which is everything that concerns the community that lives together, it's not just the state actors, whether it's the RFK people or the Biden administration who are political, but people in their public roles, including the experts and medical professionals who have the authority and expertise to speak out in political crises. You are doing a good job of being a good citizen and using your particular knowledge and voice to help sway things towards truth and care. Whereas the other doctors that you're mentioning are doing active harm in their roles as citizens. I don't know what they're doing in their private practice. Maybe they're great to their patients, but in their role as a citizen, they are doing great harm.
Yeah, and this is never more true for anything than communicable diseases, because if you don't take your high blood pressure medicines, it doesn't affect me. But if you don't get your child vaccinated against measles, they could spread it. And that's what happened. This outbreak in West Texas seeded another outbreak in Mexico, where I think like 15 children have died. So never is our interdependency more clear than when it comes to vaccine preventable diseases.
One last question, if you have time. It strikes me, and I believe you mentioned in the book that social media is almost the perfect imaginable way to spread disinformation and misinformation of any kind. I mean, it's just the perfect way for context-free nonsense, the highly inflammatory, emotionally appealing stuff that has like no sources. It's just like an infographic or some meme that's like just pushes all of your emotional buttons, and then for that to just spread far and wide before you even have a chance to debunk it, which is already, a slanted playing field, because, as again, you say in the book, it's like, it's an order of magnitude more work to debunk bullshit than it is to produce it in the first place. Also, it strikes me that the personal incentives of social media may be responsible for the behaviors of some of the people you're talking about. Like, it's quite recognizable to me as a longtime, Twitter addict, now Blue Sky addict, to see somebody in the throes of a posting spiral where they're just saying, they have a bad take and they double down and they double down and they refuse to admit error, and they become progressively more extreme and unhinged and angry at the people who are criticizing them. And it's just this almost magic formula for producing a tidal wave of disinformation and so forth. And so I don't know. I mean, like, I could think of some regulations in that effect. You could just send the troops in to shut Facebook off. But you could also like break these companies up. You could ban surveillance advertising, which would basically just destroy their business model at a stroke. But do you have any thoughts about, the broader role of social media and what we might do to combat the incredible toxicity it's unleashed on us?
Well, I can describe it better than I can propose solutions. So let me tell you a story that really showed me the power of social media and sort of the dangers of being blind to it. So yeah, being a social media addict is not something you sort of normally brag about, but I think people who were not on social media, especially my fellow doctors, had no idea what was going on. They thought the past 5 years was kind of business as normal for the most part, and it wasn't. And they didn't realize it until it was too late. So here's the story. So I had a conversation with someone who was very high up in the Florida Department of Health. He worked there before Joseph Ladapo got in. He is the utter crank who is the current Florida Surgeon General, who has said COVID vaccines are the Antichrist. I mean, he's really spoken about them in these kind of hyper-religious terms, and that it's God's will that he oppose vaccines, for example. Anyways, so I spoke with someone who was high up before Ladapo arrived, who worked in Florida during the devastating Delta wave of August 2021. When something like 70 children were going to the hospital every day, and I think just under 30 children died of COVID. And he said that it was very strange because everyone was blaming a different virus, a virus called RSV, and saying that it wasn't COVID that was doing this. And he said, I have no idea where that came from. I said, I know exactly where that came from. That came from a single Twitter post by someone who now works at the FDA, a doctor by the name of Tracy Beth Hogue, who just kind of looked at random squiggly lines on a graph and saw that for one age group, COVID was going down for 1 week. And at that same time period, RSV rates were going up a teeny tiny little bit. And she said, I wonder if it's possible that doctors are misdiagnosing their patients. And I actually wrote a whole article about this on Science-Based Medicine. It was not the case. Doctors have PCR tests to distinguish between these two viruses. So this was not happening. But it apparently became an important myth in Florida that allowed officials there as an excuse not to take any efforts to try to mitigate COVID. So that really shows how a single doctor just asking questions on social media can start a cascade of misinformation and disinformation that had a bunch of consequences in the real world. That's number one. And the other thing that you referenced is how social media influence doctors in return. And the term for this is audience capture. And that this occurs when people and none of us are immune to this. We are all vulnerable for this. Is that doctors who become influencers get incentivized to produce more radical content. So if you read not doctors' social media posts, but some of the replies to them, you will see this sort of hateful bile of the followers that they accumulated. And they had meanwhile blocked anyone who may provide a source of sanity or a corrective to their misinformation. And again, they became incentivized to produce ever more sort of escalating content. So take Vinay Prasad, for example. He, in 2020, was a kind of controversial for sure, but generally very widely respected doctor who is now correctly viewed as a total crank who is hell-bent on destroying everything. And he would be totally unrecognizable to himself. He would not recognize himself. He is a totally different person. In 2020, he was saying, we need civil discourse and debate, and we shouldn't attack people with name calling. And fast forward to today, he's making these vulgar videos saying these lying pieces of shit don't deserve forgiveness because they're fucking still lying. And, this sort of rhetoric has been rightfully blamed for the terrorist attack on the CDC that left one heroic police officer dead. So that has been the role of social media as both a disseminator of misinformation and a radicalizer of people. And I think that we need to appreciate that. Now, how to fix it, that's someone else's job. I have no clue.
Do you mind, Jonathan, if I have one last question?
Sure.
Just because I appreciate a lot of the numbers in your book, and you already mentioned 1.2 million Americans were killed during COVID. There's also a number, 232,000 deaths that could have been averted from a particular study had more people been vaccinated. Without getting into like all the various reasons that fewer people got vaccinated, from these doctors to the anti-vaxxers going back decades to the political parties. Just in terms of like a counterfactual, had things gone the way that they should have, is 232,000 just a conservative number about how many deaths were unnecessary, or what's your way of thinking through what could or should have been in terms of a better approach to dealing with COVID than we had?
Yeah, so I don't know what the exact, no one knows what the exact number would be because we don't sort of have an Earth 2.0 to rerun things. Either way, that's about as many as Americans, I think, who died in World War I. It's a huge number of preventable deaths. And because they occurred kind of one by one in hospitals throughout the country, it didn't have the same attention as sort of a 9/11, for example, which obviously occurred in a single instant in time in a single place in time. But it should be, I think, viewed as similarly catastrophic that thousands, and many of these people were young, especially during the Delta and especially during the Omicron wave. Again, I'm not big on solutions, and it's just that I just don't think I have the answers other than to just document the problem and to hopefully in my grandiose vision, my books serve as an important reference for someone 100 years from now who's trying to understand, a single piece of the puzzle of how America destroyed itself starting from 20 to 2025. And again, in my grandiose vision, it will inspire future medical leaders to not tolerate disinformation. I'm not talking about firing doctors or penalizing them, just speaking out. What I did and what Peter Hotez did and Dr. David Gorski at Science Based Medicine and many other people, it should have been normal, right? It should have been kind of intolerable. Instead, the medical profession behaved no differently in a lot of ways. I mean, this is going to be maybe a little histrionic, but then churches who protected pedophile priests. Again, I don't mean to compare the doctors I talk about to pedophiles. I mean, that's a horrible thing. But the same sort of herd mentality of circle the wagons, protect our own. No one should pay any consequence for misinformation. And again, as we discussed, these guys were very good at weaponizing their victimhood by saying, if you correct me at all, you are a Stalinist censor. I mean, they spoke in this very grandiose language. And, you referenced too about Missouri saying it was, even tracking COVID cases was the NSA, but they did speak in these very dramatic, hysterical ways that any attempts to control COVID were akin to Nazi Germany and totalitarian states. I mean, Vinay Prasad wrote an article about how democracy dies, and where he speculated that a future pandemic would lead to, well, actually, some of the things we're seeing now: the army in the streets, mass purges and censorship of scientists. So they weaponize these sorts of fear and doubt to create the situation that they actually feared or claimed to fear. As long as it's their side putting troops in the streets, they don't seem to have a problem with it. So my biggest solution is just that members of my profession need to grow a backbone, that the media needs to stop giving people a platform once they have proven themselves to be unreliable. I mean, I concede that maybe some of these guys were at the start of the pandemic, you didn't really know what was going to happen. And so it was okay to hear their voices. But once they made their predictions of 20 to 40,000 deaths, and those predictions were obliterated by the middle of April, and they kept saying the same thing, that this is overblown, that it's all going away, that the only problem is going to be from the harms of mitigation measures, the media should have written them off as witch doctors and stopped platforming them and stopped treating them as normal. And their universities should have done the same, even though these guys wore suits, they had fancy titles, they spoke in very measured tones. Some of them were world famous, highly published doctors, but it's really the emperor's new clothes. They were so afraid of being accused of silencing people and censoring people and shutting down heterodox ideas that they refused to say, going back to Ayn Rand, A is A. They were happy with people saying A is B.
They were even attributing deaths to the lockdowns instead of to COVID, I saw in your book.
Oh, yeah. I wrote about this more in the prequel to my new book. I wrote about this in We Want Them Infected. Dr. John Ioannidis, who is probably America's second or third most famous scientist. He's not exactly a household name, but he is the world's most published scientist. He started casting doubt on the death toll from day one, saying that it was only older people who were dying. And you're not even really sure that COVID caused their deaths. As if during normal times, there are giant refrigerated trucks outside my hospital to hold the bodies. He later said death certificates couldn't be trusted and that a lot of patients died because of intubation. So he started blaming frontline healthcare workers for the death of our patients. And again, this is what I was saying before of how it was really an attack on people who had to operate in the real world. Anyone who had to treat this virus or its consequences in the real world was blamed for that. And we've started seeing this with hurricanes, where meteorologists get blamed for the hurricanes that they merely report on. So that's what these doctors did. Anyone who had to try to open a school or try to open staff a hospital or keep a nursing home free of COVID, these extremely difficult tasks, was blamed for it. And meanwhile, they undermined people who had real world responsibility. So, for example, when it came to opening schools, they dunked on masks, they dunked on ventilations, they dunked on COVID testing, they dunked on vaccines. And this all goes back to their original idea that it was good when young people got infected because that would lead to herd immunity and the pandemic. So they didn't object to mitigation measures because they thought they didn't work. That's what they'll say today. They didn't work. But in reality, they objected to them because they knew that they stopped infections and they didn't want that to happen. They will now say things like mitigation measures only delayed the inevitable. They just postponed infections from 2020 to 2021 or 2022, which is probably true. There's very few people, there's some people, but very few who have had zero COVID infections. But postponing the inevitable is all of what doctors try to do. That's the whole game. And it was much better to get infected with COVID, as I did in August 2022, than in April 2020, when the virus was brand new, when hospitals were overwhelmed. And it is worth thinking about their counterfactual. What actually would have happened had we done nothing? I mean, as Ryan said, a lot of people would have just stayed home. We didn't need shutdowns to tell us to stay home. But it would have been a disaster had 250 million unvaccinated Americans contracted COVID simultaneously, as they wanted to happen and as they proposed.
Right. And as you say, if 232,000 people would not have died had more people been vaccinated, there's got to be some of that blood on their hands, I think.
I think so. And it's strange that if you listen to them today, they say, I was right. My pandemic vision was validated. The harms of the lockdowns, they speak about them in these catastrophic terms, the worst assault on the working class since segregation in Vietnam. And
so perverse, so gross.
Yeah, I mean, it's like 99.99% of people have forgotten about lockdowns. These guys are actually very sad that lockdowns are gone because this was the peak of their influence and the peak of their fame. And now that they actually have to run things in the real world, at least some of them, they're showing that they're failing. I mean, the NIH, Jay Bhattacharya is hated there. People, disparage him. And so they're showing how good they are now at actually running things. Not so good.
Yeah. And as a closing comment, I think it's important to emphasize that, in the stew of all this contrarian revisionism about the pandemic, that we actually know perfectly well what a sort of best possible approach would have been. And it would have been basically what New Zealand did up until 2022, coupled with Sweden's vaccine rollout. So they had the zero COVID policy. That they had a relatively short but very strict lockdown at the start, and then they set up a big test, trace, isolate system so that if anybody is coming into the country, they have to go into quarantine for a couple of weeks, and if any cases are detected, then they track where you've been, and and anybody who's been exposed, and they have to go into quarantine too, and that basically stamped out infection with a couple of brief outbreaks until 2022. In New Zealand. That's a lot easier to do in an island nation, of course, than it is in like the United States. It would be very difficult to manage in such a large country. But the principle of it is there. Like, they didn't have to do the extensive lockdowns. They let their businesses were open. There were capacity restrictions and so on. But for the most part, people were just living about their daily lives. None of this painful crap had to happen if we had gotten our ducks in a row in terms of the public health bureaucracy. So instead, we're sort of like a worst possible world thing where businesses are closed, lots of them are going out of business, people are stuck at home, schools are closed, and yet none of it was done with sufficient stringency to actually stamp out community spread. And, so New Zealand didn't do quite as good of a vaccine rollout, so their 2022 was quite bad. But even still, their COVID death rate, I think last I looked it up, it's something like 1/6 that of the United States. And if we had managed something like that, or even something half as good, if we had locked down in New York before the virus was already circulating everywhere instead of after, and then then you had thousands of deaths already baked in because the virus had already spread all over the place. I think it's easily, you could have said another 500,000 lives could have been saved if we could have we delayed those infections, which we're going to get everybody eventually, but delayed them past the point where people could be vaccinated. We would have saved untold numbers of lives and untold numbers of people who would not have been disabled by a bad case of COVID because the vaccine would have protected them.
Sorry to cut you off. Yeah, I mean, the vaccines obviously aren't perfect, and
no.
As you note, it's kind of. It's hard to compare one country to another. I mean, even Sweden is a homogenous country with a universal health care.
Yep.
It's a small country of about 4 million people. So you can't really, or same with New Zealand, you can't quite extrapolate that to the United States. But no, I totally agree with you about New Zealand. But our medical establishment, Jay Bhattacharya, wrote an article about how their pandemic response failed while recognizing that they saved many lives because of their economy suffered due to a lack of international tourists because they closed their economy to international tourists. He said New Zealand's response was a failure while acknowledging that they saved many lives. It's really incredible stuff.
I went there on my honeymoon in 2022. What are you talking about, Jay? We went to Hobbiton and everything. Shut up. At least there are people alive to let us tour the place. God, it's just a sickening situation. Anyway, we should probably close it up there. The book is called Everyone Else is Lying to You, How Our Medical Establishment Weaponized Doubt to Spread COVID, Normalize Quackery, and Undermine Public Health. Jonathan Howard, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you guys for having me. Such great questions, and I appreciate the conversation. Take care.
Pleasure. Take care.
And thanks for listening, everybody. We will see you in the next episode.